Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Whenever we step into a really complex digital environment, it is incredibly easy to just get lost in the weeds of daily operations. I mean, we've all been there, right? You're putting out fires, you're managing users, you're tweaking permissions on the fly. But today we are stripping all of that away to look at the foundational blueprint. We're talking about architecting a system's core control panel. We are looking at the absolute bedrock settings that literally dictate how your entire infrastructure functions.
And that brings us here, to Lecture 20. Reaching this specific stage in our source material marks a massive shift. This is the exact moment where all those abstract theories we've been covering, they finally crystallize into actionable structural control. It's a moment of real gravitas in our system's architecture journey. We're transitioning from merely understanding how a system behaves to actually defining the parameters of that behavior.
So, here is our roadmap for today. First, a quick introduction to Lecture 20. Second, a high-level control panel overview. And third, we'll drill right down into core system settings.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Introduction to Lecture 20.
So the crucial point is understanding exactly what the authors mean when they use the word architecting. It's not just about pushing buttons or making minor administrative tweaks here and there. Architecting is the intentional structuring and foundational design of a system. Let's look at a scenario the source material highlights just to explain why this matters so much. Imagine two different deployment teams, right? Both are given the exact same software suite. Team A immediately jumps in. They're setting up user profiles as requests come in, creating ad hoc storage buckets, configuring network protocols completely on the fly. And within 6 months, their system is a tangled web of dependencies. Upgrades are causing cascading failures simply because nothing was intentionally structured. But then you have Team B. Team B takes an architect's approach. Before a single user is even onboarded, they map out the logic of the control panel. They define the global parameters, the default security inherences, and the resource allocation limits. When you sit down to configure your core settings, you aren't just an admin executing tasks. You are an architect laying down the very rules of engagement for the entire environment. Every single downstream process relies on the integrity of this initial setup. That is the fundamental difference between simply operating a system and truly architecting one.
So you might be wondering, what does Lecture 20 actually cover? How do we apply that grand strategic design to concrete realities? Because it's one thing to talk about intentional structuring, right? But how do you actually execute it when you're staring at a blank configuration screen? Well, the source provides two distinct paths to bridge this exact gap, ensuring our macro vision aligns perfectly with our micro configurations. We're going to look at how to map the terrain, and then how to calibrate the engine.
Moving right along to Section 2, our control panel overview.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the control panel overview serves as our macro view. Before manipulating a system, you absolutely must understand the landscape. This overview defines our boundaries and our main navigation arteries. It's essentially the wide-angle lens showing us exactly where our tools are kept before we even begin to build. The source material breaks this down into 3 critical zones. First up, the global dashboard. This is your telemetry. It's where you monitor system health, active sessions, and resource consumption, all at a single glance. Second, we have the identity and access management modules. This is where you strictly define who gets to see what. And third, the infrastructure topology mapping. You really have to think of the control panel not just as a menu of options, but as a centralized nervous system. If you don't understand how navigating from the Security tab impacts the Network Configuration tab, you're basically flying blind. The authors emphasize that mastering this overview isn't just about memorizing where buttons are, it's about deeply internalizing the logic of the interface. When a critical error spikes, a true architect knows exactly which section of the control panel houses the diagnostic tools, and more importantly, which interrelated systems might be affected. The overview gives you that absolutely vital spatial awareness.
And that brings us to Section 3, Core System Settings.
Here is where we hit the micro level, the basic system settings. These settings, they are the engine room. They are the actual levers of control and represent the true underlying foundation of our digital structure. If the control panel overview is the map of the facility, these system settings are the specific dials and switches on the reactor powering the whole building. The source material highlights several critical configurations that fall right under this umbrella. We're talking about global environment variables, the values that dictate how applications interact with the operating system itself. We're looking at default timeout thresholds, core memory allocation limits, and root-level cryptographic protocols. Now, these aren't the settings you just tweak every day. In fact, the text explicitly warns that altering these core configurations after a system has gone into heavy production can require massive downtime and even risks data corruption. That's exactly why architecting them correctly from day one is so vital. When you set the base time zone, the default character encoding, or the primary logging directory, you are establishing the physical laws of your digital universe. Every application, every script, and every single user will be bound by these foundational choices.
Let's move to and see how this builds together, because you really cannot master one without the other. The macro map of the control panel directly informs the precise, foundational configurations of your core settings. The broad overview tells you where you are and how different subsystems interact. The system settings give you the actual power to change how those subsystems operate. Imagine trying to tune a high-performance database without knowing where the performance metrics are visualized in the dashboard. No way, right? Conversely, knowing every corner of the interface is completely useless if you don't understand the underlying core settings that dictate the system's actual limits. The source text makes it crystal clear. True architectural mastery exists in the synthesis of these two domains. It's this continuous loop between observing the macro landscape and tuning those micro configurations.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what the authors of this lecture set out to teach us. By dissecting both the control panel overview and the basic system settings, we see the complete philosophy of systems architecture in action. It gives us both the compass to navigate the ecosystem and the wrench to tune its core. Think about your own daily workflows for a second. How often are you just reacting to a system rather than intentionally directing it? Mastering these two pillars allows you to shift from being a reactive administrator to a proactive architect. You literally stop fighting the system and you start defining it. So, we've mapped the macro terrain and we've identified the foundational levers of control. But as we know, mapping isn't building. Are you ready to step completely out of the role of an administrator and become the architect? Take these blueprints, apply them to your own digital environments, and ask yourself, are you just operating your system, or are you truly architecting it?